know that people will be joining me. So welcome everyone today to Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario's webinar on preventing domestic homicides with older couples, lessons learned from tragedies. Today we're pleased to have join us Margaret MacPherson and Dr. Peter Jaffee, who are our guest speakers. And we're doing this in recognition of victims and survivors of week. That was last week. We've been doing several presentations from last week and continuing from this week. There's been a lot of interest in these issues around supporting victims and survivors and looking at key issues. So we decided to expand our webinar series for 2 weeks. So before we begin, I'd like to give our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we gather on the traditional territory of a number of First Nations and acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the ages. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one that is based in honor and deep respect. So before we begin, I want to give a few housekeeping items. Everyone will be muted during the presentation today. The speakers will be visible when they're presenting today, and you will have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end of the webinar today. As I indicated, we have our ASL interpreters joining us. You can adjust the images of the speakers and the ASL interpreters by either changing your view at the very top of your screen. There's a little grid box where you can either have a gallery view or speaker view. And if you don't have that option on your application, then there is a line between the speakers and the presentation that you can pull to the left, and that will make the visuals a lot larger. There is a chat box available for you to make comments in. You may want to say something to a colleague if you see somebody online, or if you have a comment about something that the presenters are saying today. If you have a specific question that you want to ask at the end of the session, we do appreciate you putting that into the Q&A box. That allows us to make sure your question is answered, because we don't want to miss something that's posted in the chat box, because many people will be posting things during the session. So just a reminder, we may remind you during the session in the chat box if we see people accidentally doing that, just to post it back into the Q&A box. We are recording the webinar today. The webinar session, PowerPoint and video will be uploaded to our website within the next day or two. You will get a reminder from Zoom just saying that the session has been posted, and just a reminder of the evaluation if you haven't finished that. You will see a pop-up on your screen after the webinar just asking for your feedback. We do appreciate that feedback. It probably takes less than a minute. I think there's 7 questions just to give us feedback on the session today, and an opportunity to disclose any future topics or ideas that you would like us to present in the future. It really does help us guide our webinars to make sure that they're meeting your needs in the community. And before we get to the speakers, I do want to just indicate that we do respect everyone's privacy and confidentiality during all of our webinars. And we do understand there are circumstances where people may have personal situations that they do want assistance with. We are here at Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario to provide information and referrals and assistance in those issues. And our speakers can talk in generality terms if you have a general question related to a situation. But if you would like more personal response and your information keep confidential, you can contact us after, and our contact information is posted at the end of this session, as well as on our website for further contacts, emails, and phone numbers. For those who are joining us for the first time, and you are familiar with our organization, Elder Abuse Ontario, Prevention Ontario, our goal and mission really is to make sure seniors feel safe and respected and have a strong voice. And we do this through raising awareness. We do education and training, such as our webinars today. And we work collaboratively with our community partners, including CREVOC, on a number of initiatives with organizations to help increase the services and coordination and advocacy for older adults and programs to support seniors and prevent elder abuse and those living at risk of harm, and making sure that people feel safe and respected. So we work with many agencies, not only locally, but also provincially, nationally, and across borders. Our organization was given the opportunity to implement Ontario's strategy to combat elder abuse back in 2003, and we've been actively working under the three main pillars of that strategy, which are public education awareness, training frontline staff, and coordination of community services. So we, as I indicated before, we do a number of initiatives around awareness, and people are probably familiar with World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. We do a lot of education campaigns throughout the year. If you've seen our Facebook page, we just recently launched a video around ageism, and there's another one coming. So we're constantly educating and promoting any ways that we can to get the message out to the community around elder abuse prevention. We do training to all sectors of agencies and organizations as well. So we're doing this webinar today, as I say, we're around public education awareness. We do campaigns, and one of the areas that we've been focused on for the last 2 weeks is around the Victims and Survivors of Crime Week. So we received money through the Department of Justice Canada to do a number of webinars and some different projects. And we did an award ceremony recognizing volunteers working with elder abuse networks. We did that last week, and today we're pleased to host this presentation as part of that initiative. So I'd just like to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Peter Jaffee, we're so pleased that you're able to join us today. He's a psychologist and professor emeritus at and a founding director of the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children in the Faculty of Education at Western University. Peter is, he's co-authored 11 books, 40 chapters and 80 articles related to domestic violence and the impact of domestic violence on children, homicide prevention, and the role of the criminal and family justice systems. He was also in 2009, he was named an officer in the Order of Canada by the Governor General for his work preventing domestic violence in the community. So welcome, Peter. And Margaret MacPherson, she's a research associate with the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. Margaret designs and develops curriculum related to materials on a number of initiatives, including Make It Our Business, Workplace Domestic Violence, and as many of you are probably familiar with, the It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults. Margaret is so passionate in her belief that everyone has an important contribution to make in creating safe and supportive environments at work and in our communities. I have the great pleasure of working with Margaret on a number of initiatives. She's a great colleague, and I can honored to say she's my friend. So Margaret, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rayanne. And Peter, you can take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. And it's a pleasure to present with Margaret. As you said, she's very passionate and she talks me into many presentations all the time. But this is one I'm particularly excited about. In starting, I should say at the outset that talking about these issues is traumatic. Obviously, if you're a police officer, a therapist, someone working with seniors who are struggling and dealing with abuse, even if you're a researcher reading reports about terrible things that happen to people, you can suffer from vicarious trauma, which means that you will develop PTSD the same way your clients do. So as you hear the stories and take them in, they will impact you in a variety of ways, and you'll have trauma symptoms yourself. So I mentioned that at the outset, and encouraging all of you to be actively involved in self-care if you're not doing that already. Next slide. For the last 40 years of my life, I've been studying domestic violence, and more recently looked in greater detail at the issue of domestic homicides. I was fortunate to work with Myrna Dawson, a criminologist at Guelph University, together with 12 other universities and 60 community partners, looking at domestic homicides across the country, looking at data from medical examiners, chief coroners across the country, as well as media reports and court decisions. And in tracking the number of domestic homicides across the country, you can see some fairly shocking numbers here, that between 2010 and 2019, there are 815 domestic homicides across the country. Look at the next slide. The vast majority of adult victims are women. This is a gender-based crime, and it's not only in Canada, but across the world. Women represent 80% of all victims of domestic homicide. When men are victims and women are perpetrators, usually half those cases, that woman has had a prior history of abuse from her partner. So it's important to understand that this is very much gender-based. Perpetrators were 86% men. You can see the average age, but there's quite a range from young adults, older teenagers involved in dating relationships, and older adults that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. I just want to mention at the outset that it's important to look at our work in a context of people's lives. Obviously, there are many vulnerable populations. Obviously, older couples, older individuals may be vulnerable for a number of different reasons. In our research, one of the issues we looked at was background from different vulnerable populations. We looked at Indigenous victims, immigrant and refugee, people in rural, remote, northern parts of the country, and also children killed in the context of domestic violence, which represents about 11% of all domestic homicides across Canada. And the major point I wanted to make with this information is that over half our cases that we looked at reviewing domestic homicides represented one or more of these vulnerable populations. Again, repeating myself, there are many vulnerable populations, including men and women in same-sex relationships, women with disabilities, older women. But of the four populations we looked at, over half belong to one or more of these vulnerable populations. And some suffered homicides disproportionate to the general population. For example, Indigenous women are killed at many times a number compared to the representation in the general population. So you see populations that are vulnerable for a number of different reasons. The next slide, please. In doing the research, when we were looking at risk factors associated with domestic homicide, in these four populations, we were looking at what factors make each one of these groups vulnerable. And without going into all the details, obviously Indigenous women are victims of historical abuse, colonization, the impact of residential schools, intergenerational trauma, and they're very much at risk because they may live in multi-generational families with long histories of abuse, both that they suffered within residential schools and also within their communities. And they may be more hesitant to reach out for support, may be more distrustful of police or government for obvious reasons. So I just use that group as one example and really look at the circle in the center of the slide, which is when you look at vulnerable populations, you always end up with some similar factors: isolation, limited services, inadequate response time, when people need assistance, long waiting lists, economic inequality, and living in situations where there are norms conducive of domestic violence. So these are important factors, and obviously some of these factors relate to our topic for today. Next slide, please. In looking at domestic homicides, we have learned a great deal from the work of the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. In brief, I've been a member of the Death Review Committee since it began in 2003. It is a multidisciplinary committee that reviews every domestic homicide in the province, and it tries to understand what happened, who knew what, when, and are there lessons to be learned. And the way I describe this work, when I have 4 boys, and they ask me when I go to meetings, they ask me why I do this. Isn't it depressing? And what I always say to them, that I imagine that I'm an airplane crash investigator. That I'm looking for the black box. I'm looking to understand what happened. Was it weather? Was it the nature of the aircraft manufacturer? Was it pilot training? I know I can't bring back the passengers, but I'm going to be damn sure that if there's a way to prevent a crash in similar circumstances in the future, we'll do everything possible to make sure pilots and air traffic control and airline manufacturers are aware of these issues. Next slide. So that's what we do with the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. Their motto that they have in their office is, "We speak for the dead to protect the living." So we actively look at each case and try to identify all the issues, not in a blaming or shaming exercise, but more to understand what happened and how could it be prevented in the future. And again, that's critical. And if whenever I talk about any of our cases, and I won't be disclosing any personal information today, other than what's reported in the media, I'm always have to remind myself and all of us that we're not blaming and shaming, that at the end of the day, what are the lessons to be learned and what can we do in similar circumstances in the future? Next slide. The next slide. So just to give you a sample of our work, between 2003 and 2017, we reviewed 311 cases involving 445 deaths. So obviously some of the cases involved multiple deaths. 65% are homicides, 35% are homicide suicides. The most common warning signs are a history of domestic violence and actual or pending separation. When someone says the relationship is over, they're leaving, they've contacted a lawyer, they still may be living in the same house, but in separate rooms. Those are significant risk factors. And we find that very few of these cases happen out of the blue. 71% have 7 or more risk factors known to friends, family, potentially frontline professionals who saw the warning signs but weren't sure what to say or what to do. Next slide. So other risk markers, I mentioned prior history of violence, actual pending separation, stalking behavior. Depression is a #1 mental health problem in perpetrators of domestic violence. #1 problem. It's often overlooked. We train mental health professionals to think about depression, to ask about suicidal ideation, suicide threats, but we don't train mental health professionals to actually ask about homicide or homicidal ideation. Prior threats to commit suicide or attempt suicide by the perpetrator, and escalation of violence. Next slide. Who knows what? So generally, multiple people know about these risk factors before the homicide. Family knows the most, then friends, police, family or criminal lawyers, co-workers. So a number of people in the extended family network, friendships, and also frontline professionals have warning signs that they know about. And sometimes, as I said, they don't know what to do with the warning sign, or they haven't shared information with others to look at common concerns and the need to take action. Next slide. So again, repeating really what I said earlier, when I looked at the slide about the risk factors and what may be unique for different populations, it's important that although we talk about domestic homicides, it is a very heterogeneous group of individuals. It's a very heterogeneous population, and the context of their lives is critical. Sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, language, culture. There's so many factors. So whenever I talk about this for a short presentation, and today I'm only giving you highlights over about 25-minute period, I'm conscious that I have a tendency and others to oversimplify it. We don't capture the reality of people's lives. And this slide is just to remind me and you how complex this work really is. Next slide. When we talk about domestic homicides with older adults, a couple of things I wanted to single out. There's been lots of research on this topic. The Quebec Coroner's Office did a study a number of years ago in looking at older adults. And I actually should say something critical. When people do research on older adults and seniors, different researchers use different age ranges. So a lot of the research they called older 55 years of age and older, and 55 to me is a spring chicken. But so for some researchers, 55 is seen as older. Other researchers look at 65 and older. So as I review these studies, ages may vary, but the themes remain the same. From the Quebec Coroner's Office, most of the homicides are perpetrated by males. 70% are murder-suicides. 75% of the cases, the perpetrator suffered from major depression. Victims had pre-existing medical conditions. Often perpetrators were caregivers to chronically ill spouses. This is a theme we see over and over again. And few perpetrators had received any psychiatric help. Next slide. There was another study recently published, and Margaret and I are pleased to provide you with all the references. This is a study that was a meta-analysis of 49 studies across the world. Same themes, homicides, suicides, older and male, some other risk factors, adversity during childhood, legal issues, problems in the past, exposure to stressful and or traumatic events before the homicide. And again, significant contribution through depressive disorder and also psychotic delusional convictions. And let me just stop on that point for a moment. In our death review committee, in the last year, we have reviewed several cases of individuals with dementia that believed their spouses were having affairs with other men. And these are beliefs that were complete delusions. There was no basis in fact. It was a delusion. And there's actually research on dementia and these delusions and how some men are more violent and dangerous with dementia as a factor, and also having a history of trauma, military background, together with some other factors. So there's an emerging research on this issue. Next slide, please. There are many cases that you've read about in the media, and I'm just picking out one case because I think it's symbolic of some of the problems, not all the problems, but some of the problems. And this is a case, actually, if you did a search, all this information is public. It was a case out of the Peterborough area, and I'm not picking on anybody from Peterborough. I'm always hesitant when I pick one case from one jurisdiction. This could happen anywhere. The perpetrator name was Terry Finn. He shot his wife in a parking lot at a Home Depot parking lot, and then told another bystander to call the police, and he was arrested, taken into custody, and he was charged with first-degree homicide. You can actually find these articles and actually you can see an interview that he does with the police. That's part of the media report. Some factors about Terry Finn, which I think are important, is he was a gun collector. The weekend before he killed his wife, he had threatened to commit suicide. He was gonna shoot himself. So his wife knew this. He had adult sons who knew this, and the family talked about taking away his guns for his own safety and the safety of others, but the guns remained in his possession. A neighbor and close friend of the victim, Sandra, had said to her that she had to get out of the house before something happened because she was worried about guns in the home. And again, there's many more details about this case, but this is a case of an older individual who's depressed. He's dealing with other health conditions. He has access to weapons. And in this case, there was a long history of domestic violence. And it's one of those deaths that clearly looks predictable and preventable with hindsight. Next slide, Margaret. When you look at domestic violence with older adults, we have to start by saying that the older population has the lowest rate of domestic violence. Actually, the highest rate is with 15 to 24-year-olds. But it's still a significant issue. Close to 3,000 individuals over age 55 report spousal violence in Canada, according to 2011 Statistics Canada report. And the reporting rates are conservative and are thought to be increasing based on reports from shelters and others. Important factor for older women is that their experiences with domestic violence are different. There's a higher level of physical, emotional, financial barriers to leaving a relationship, a greater likelihood of dependency, and more traditional beliefs about not contacting the police. And our colleague Barb McQuarrie and Margaret, who worked on a national study with over 8,000 Canadians, found significant difference with older Canadians' views on whether it was appropriate or whether you needed to call the police or get outsiders involved. So clearly we live with a new generation of women who've part of the Me Too movement and are much more aware, more likely to be part of violence prevention programs in schools, universities, and colleges and public education programs. But older adults are much more hesitant to name something as domestic violence or seek support or call the police for all the traditional reasons we never talked about this issue before. Next slide, please. Of the research that has been done, couples are often in intact marriages, so separation is not usually a factor. Husbands continue to be the large majority of perpetrators. Physical health problems are common, both for the perpetrator and the victim. Depression, dementia, potentially with the victim, and also we've seen dementia with the perpetrator. And often the perpetrator is in a caretaker role. So homicide is very different with the older age group. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but all this slide says in a picture is that couples in our death review committee that we've reviewed since 2003, homicide suicides are predominantly individuals 55 years of age and older. Next slide. If you look at risk factors, again, I'm not going to go through each one of these risk factors, but these are the top 5 risk factors across ages. And you can see that if you go to the far right, 55 and older, depression that's been diagnosed by a family doctor, healthcare professional is a significant factor for that population. Next slide. The older population have less risk factors compared to the younger population. For example, 26 years of age and younger, looking at homicides within that age group, 91% of those couples had 7 or more risk factors. If you look at age 55 and older, 41% had 7 or more risk markers. So the older population tend to have major risk factors, but not a large number of risk factors that show up on traditional risk assessment tools that the police or shelters would use in assessing risk for victims. So it requires special care and thinking when you're dealing with older adults. Next slide. Again, another thing that's common with individuals 55 years of age and older, there are less eyes on what's happening within their family. Less likely to have police occurrence, less likely to have family. 50% have family knows what's going on, but less likely, less friends aware. And obviously, as they reach the age of retirement, less likely to have coworkers and neighbors not aware. Only 1 in 7 neighbors had any idea about the problems that the couple was experiencing. Next slide. So in the past, our Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, with every death that's reviewed, we make a number of recommendations. They go to different government ministries, and they may go to professional bodies, such as the College of Social Workers or College of Psychologists. So recommendations are geared to different organizations. So I just want to give you examples. These are a couple of recommendations. One, individuals and organizations providing healthcare services and support to aging couples with declining or poor health should receive enhanced education and training about their increased risk of intimate partner homicide, suicide, particularly if the male is in the caretaker role for his female partner, and there's been other major life events. Another recommendation dealing with healthcare, police, about enhanced education and training, looking with older couples, particularly if they're experiencing declining or poor health with some other major life changes. Next slide. Again, these problems have certainly increased during COVID-19 with the increasing isolation and less eyes from friends, family, neighbors on what may be happening. And this recent study talked about some of the same themes, males in caregiver roles, health issues in one or both individuals, depression, suicidal ideation, and access to firearms. And again, same recommendations about the need for proper screening and access to weapons and referrals to specialized mental health professionals. Next slide. So just to summarize before I turn over to Margaret, obviously domestic violence in older couples is really not taken seriously. It's not considered or identified as a major issue. Actually, I reviewed one case where an older gentleman who was a caregiver to his wife who suffered from some serious illnesses talked to the doctor in emergency about having a double suicide. And the doctors in their notes indicated that they didn't think that was possible because he seemed like such a committed individual and was such an excellent caregiver to his wife and dealt with the suicide threat per se without recognizing what the message was. Older victims are more reluctant to disclose violence. There's often a lack of screening. Minor charges, we've had some cases where there were warning signs in terms of willful damage, trespassing, harassing behavior, which should have been taken more seriously with hindsight. A need to look at basic issues around safety planning and risk management, and a need for public education and also professionals educated on these issues. And I could tell you about dozens of cases where adult children saw many of the warning signs and didn't foresee the ultimate consequences, which in our view, look predictable and preventable. Margaret, over to you. You're muted, Margaret.
Yes, of course. I'll come back to this talking about it's not right in a few minutes, but thank you, Peter. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a chapter in domestic homicide book that Peter was an editor on. And I took this out of the, I think it was in the foreword, the sense about how tragic it is that we see these things happening and that we can't seem to put things in place to prevent them from happening. And so always we're working toward this idea about preparing people to take small and large steps, you know, to respond to warning signs when they first see them happening. I wanted to start just sort of with the global sense of the world, because it is not just particular to any one part of the globe, really. And in 2012, it was first acknowledged that older women are especially vulnerable to human rights abuses related to neglect, abuse, and violence. And then in 2013, there was a brief that was released that looked into the issue. And the report was really a clear indictment that women in their senior years who experience domestic violence continue to be largely unseen in research data and in terminology used by academics to describe and classify violence and abuse. So older women really do sit at the nexus of powerful forces that combine to create profound social isolation and invisibility on cohort-specific issues. And then, of course, the intersections of gender, age, ability, race, class, sexual orientation, and health combine under systemic inequities to form really unique barriers that obstruct older women's human rights, personal safety, and social supports. So we need to examine domestic homicides of older women to explore the relationships between discriminatory social norms and gaps in research and practice that continue to be held in place by pervasive social norms of ageism. In recent years, so this is the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, was launched a few years ago now, looking into femicide in particular. So the killing of women by men in their lives. It's an important addition to our, you know, the way we think about how these things happen. So femicide is a broader category that it takes in not just intimate partners, but other family members, friends, acquaintances, and strangers. Just to give you a sense about, you know, and the thing that strikes me is that people are not aware how commonly these deaths are taking place, because often we only know what's happening in local stories. There's a few cases sort of are elevated to sort of national prominence. But, you know, just in 2020, there were 10 women or girls killed by men for every month of the year, and half of those were killed by an intimate partner. The Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses has been also publishing sort of provincial femicide reports for many, many years. And this year they've started releasing monthly reports that give us a sense about what's happening across the year. So far this year, we've seen an increase in Ontario, over 47% of femicides from this time last year. So you can see at the bottom sort of the breakdown of the perpetrators. 20 of them are intimate partners, 14 are other male family members. 9 are sort of known to the victim. We know them and we know what the relationship is. And then there are relationships where we still don't know yet sort of what the relationship is, but it's been ascertained that she was killed as a woman. In this month's report, the October report, they made a statement really about older women ages 55 and older. They're continuing to experience higher rates. So they're really seeing an escalation here. And in the month of October, 60% of the femicides were 55 and older. So, you know, really We have to be paying attention to what's happening. I know that Peter mentioned that although, you know, a lot of the domestic homicides, you see a history of domestic violence, we're also seeing cases where there is no evident prior history of domestic violence. And this is kind of unexplored territory where health issues overlap in ways that are quite specific to older couples. It's in these cases as well that a mental health issue, or mercy killing, sometimes they're called, or suicide pacts are described, especially when one partner can no longer provide the kind of care that's needed by the other. But the wishes of the victim are often unclear or unreported, and regardless of the motive, the majority of the women killed did not experience a merciful method of death. So it's a questionable way to talk about these things. This is the hardest kind of proof, really, when women are killed by their male partners, that it is a significant issue that we need to pay attention to. As you know, as the population ages, we're going to see increasing numbers. And women experience kind of this triple threat idea of being a woman, being an older woman, and being an older woman who's experiencing violence. And then if you lay over top of that the intersections of race and class and sexual orientation, you know, there's increasing vulnerabilities that go with that. So as Peter said, so important to really understand the intersections, the specifics of people's lives. And of course, violence is not just an individual issue, right? It's not, we need to take a broader sort of ecological view and to understand the systemic and structural violence that's at play. The idea that domestic violence only affects younger women doesn't happen by accident. It's part of the systemic ageism that operates as a kind of structural violence in actually excluding older age cohorts from study samples. So that, you know, that study that I talked about from the UN talked a lot about global and national surveys where the cutoff age for looking at domestic violence at a global level was 49. That was they didn't look at older couples. So that's right there a problem that has to be rectified. And of course, there's gaps in research too. The 40-year age range, like when we talk about older women, I think Peter mentioned, you know, what does that mean? Who do we count when we talk about older women? And we're actually talking about as much as a 40-year age range where you have very different sort of times of life that are taking place. And so, you know, what are those differences? And then we have three sort of competing research paradigms that have their own mandates and terminologies that make it very difficult to have a coherent picture of what's happening to older women sort of across the lifespan. And of course, this has a domino effect, because if you're not researching, if you don't have numbers to qualify investments toward supporting people, there is not going to be funding available for them. And in fact, that's reflected in the current system, you know, because everything is skewed toward the people that we pay attention to. So violence has not been considered a health issue for older people. Like, so this is the sector differences idea, like just to give you a sense of it. It hasn't been considered a health issue for older people. And so it kind of sits apart from the traditional scope of healthcare policy, education, and services. And until recently, the violence against women sector hasn't really looked at the unique needs of older women. So, you know, you have different kinds of barriers and systemic issues that sort of combine to make it more difficult for older women. We know that healthcare professionals themselves say it's difficult for them to recognize warning signs and risk factors. They don't get a lot of training in it. And, you know, sort of the systemic sort of ageism has a tendency to reduce people talking about aspects of their lives being reduced down to, you know, signs of aging and normal kinds of issues that people can be expected. So in a way, the warning signs can be dismissed or just chalked up to aging. And of course, because women experience different kinds of systemic inequities, this is where you think about sort of the gender wage gap over a lifetime. You think about what we've learned from COVID about precarious incomes and, how the ways in which your sex really limits your earning power over your lifetime. As women age, absolutely their horizons for action diminish, and they see themselves as having fewer life choices within the scope of decreasing power all around them. I'll never forget sort of Jane Fonda, and there's a series on Netflix, and she stood in a store and yelled, "I am not irrelevant." And I thought, that is really a true statement for our time. Many older abused women are surprised to learn that their experiences are even considered to be abnormal or worthy of special services. And, there's lots of reasons for this, including, I think Peter mentioned, being raised in a time when we just didn't name these things, we didn't talk about them. And so even being able to name for yourself what's happening to you requires a willingness of the people around you to talk about what's happening and to be able to recognize themselves when things aren't okay. So, change is possible. Like these are, when I was doing the research for the chapter, I thought, I did it over the Christmas holidays, and I thought, wow, this is a pretty depressing way to spend the holidays. But always I feel buoyed by the spirit of change and innovation that is possible, that we see happening. We see people all around us doing incredible things to make changes in the system. And so I want to be part of that. And so I'm working with Rayanne and Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. We're working with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse to develop a national strategy, kind of a roadmap about what we can do as individuals, organizations, and communities to actually take the steps that are needed to move in a kind of a common direction to address abuse and neglect of older adults more generally. So that will be, we're working on that now. We'll be publishing that in the new year, and we'll be having lots of conversations with people about what everyone can do, because everyone does have a role to play, but they have to know, sort of have ideas about what they can do. Another, I think, important investment that's been made that is absolutely forward thinking is the Public Health Agency of Canada has made significant investments to develop health equity oriented curriculum that acknowledges the intersections of oppression and violence as health issues that persist in relationships, systems, and society. So equity oriented education, if we think about it across disciplines, not just limited to the healthcare sector, that's a strategic direction that has long-term sort of potential implications to interrupt these silos and the different sectors that operate in their own ways. It is a way to build bridges. And it provides the foundation for developing shared principles and practices that put individuals, it's based on the encounters that we have with people and understanding that in many people's lives, most people's lives, there's a trauma background that can help you understand lives and behavior and stories. These are two references that I can point to. Equip Healthcare is a great resource for these investments that have been made by the Public Health Agency. It's all evidence-based. It's excellent. There's a toolkit there that you can go and look at in terms of how do I become trauma and violence informed in my practice? How can my organization function as a trauma and violence informed organization? How can we do this as a community? And then the Gender, Trauma, and Violence Knowledge Incubator at Western University is another place where you can find resources. We can learn, this is something that we can learn, it's like it can start today. You can practice a universal precaution in the broadest sense. If you think about everyone you meet has had some kind of trauma in their lives, and you don't have to know their story in order to be caring, and to understand that people don't do things without a reason, that there is always sort of shifting this idea that there are good people and bad people. there are legacies of trauma that are untreated in our lives, in our communities, that we really have to come to grips with. And so working with families, not separating people into those piles, and figuring out how to support change is fundamental to these ideas. You know, people can change their behavior. So people who are acting in an abusive way, they often don't recognize their behavior as such, and they need someone who cares about them to talk with them about what they're seeing happen, to be able to name specific kinds of warning signs, and to talk with someone about their risk for becoming violent, for becoming abusive. We want these kinds of conversations need to happen so much earlier. And then this is a project that I've worked on for a long time with many partners across Canada. It has been one of the most wonderful experiences of my career in working with passionate advocates and researchers across the country to develop It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults. And so this is derived directly from the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee that found that it's the people right around the situation who know what's happening, but they don't know what to do about it. And so teach everyone to recognize warning signs, how to respond safely and effectively, and where to find help in their community. These are fundamentals that everyone can learn. It's Not Right was funded as a pan-Canadian project. So we've piloted this program in every province and territory in the country, and it's time to reinvest in it, because we know that people benefit when they know what to do, when they see things happening. And so I'll just make a little plug for Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. So in Ontario, they do the training on It's Not Right, and you can contact them to talk about it. There are also provincial networks in other provinces and territories that we've worked on this together. You can find training there. So look for your provincial or territorial elder abuse network and talk to them about it. You know, we want to teach everyone to recognize risk factors and to understand, you know, that sometimes people cope with trauma through drinking. The ACEs talks about the intergenerational. So this was the American study done that makes the link between trauma and violence across a lifespan, that informs the way we understand violence is not happening to particular groups, but thinking about it in a sort of a generational sense. We want to teach everyone to recognize risk when it's taking place and how to respond. And then learning to manage risk as a community means that we have to work together, and we have to be able to collaborate and coordinate our actions. That requires leadership and vision and a willingness to do things like look at the trauma and violence informed principles as an organizing factor that could help people learn to manage risk as a community. So these are the kinds of conversations that need to take place. So that's the end of my presentation. I believe we're going to take some questions if there's questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Margaret, Peter. Much appreciated. Your presentations were very in-depth and wonderful. We have a couple questions, so let's jump right into those. The first question is there any research regarding violence against men by women?
Yes. So there is extensive research. In general, men represent less than 20%, probably as low as 15% of victims of domestic violence. And as I indicated, about half those cases, there was a prior history. So there's elements of self-defense or self-protection. So, and I just want to indicate for the record, I'm not sure where the question is coming from, but I get this, wherever I present, I get that question. And I'm not sure whoever asked it, what they meant, but I'll just anticipate what I usually get. I just want to be very clear that I love men. I love my father. I have 4 sons, and I work actively to look at protecting boys and girls. And if I have clients who are men who are abused, I take the same steps in terms of trying to provide appropriate protection and security. But if we're looking at dealing with domestic violence, the overwhelming nature of it involves women as victims.
Thank you, Peter, for saying that. Next question is, it sounds like it's from a service provider that works help crisis line. And she's looking at, is there a particular screening question that can help identify if somebody may be at risk, and follow-up questions so they can assess that risk level, like any suicidal ideations?
Let me start, and then Margaret, I know, has definite ideas, but I think a general tool looking at domestic violence is using the danger assessment scale developed by Jackie Campbell. You can look it up online and download it. It's 20 items. Some of the items aren't as appropriate for an older population. I would say for an older population, important things to look at are depression. Important things to look at are caregiver role, the pressure on. The most common situation is the husband is a caregiver, the wife's declining health. And then let me just say something very, very clear. A lot of people worry about talking about suicide or homicide because I think they're putting ideas in somebody's mind. Nothing could be further from the truth. To deal with homicide, you have to talk to people about whether it's something they're thinking about and how they're thinking about it. If you don't put it on the table, people don't think you're comfortable talking about it as a healthcare provider. I'd also ask about homicidal ideation. Are there ways that you've thought, to end this pain for yourself or for your partner? So I would put it on the table. I think it's important to address, but people are hesitant to do so. Margaret, do you want to add to that?
Yes, there is. I understand there. So the Be Safer risk assessment tool is one that we work with a lot. It's, any tool, there's no such thing as a perfect tool, but that one is also being adapted for older adult abuse and neglect. And I don't believe it's publicly available yet. It's in the process of being validated, but they're very close. So that's Stephen Hart and Randall Kropp I think are the researchers behind that. So that's coming. But I think learning how to have these conversations is fundamental and needs to be happening. How do you talk with someone when you're concerned about their behavior? If you can talk about the specific risk, if you can identify what the risk factors are, and then name them and talk about the risk for things getting worse, that's a kind of strategy about how to engage people in the conversation. So I think that's learning we have to do across service systems, is how to have those kind of conversations.
Thank you, Margaret. Very well said. Very well said. One last question for both of you. This sounds like it's coming from a domestic violence center. So if somebody discloses domestic violence at a SW or SSW as an SW, we cannot report without the victim's consent. When does it cross the line in duty to care when you report elder abuse, or does it ever? So I think they're looking for that consent piece.
I'll start, then Margaret. I think this is my view, and if you talk to 10 lawyers, they might give you 10 different views. My view is if you know there's imminent risk of harm, then you have to do something, in my view. You have an obligation morally and ethically. At the end of the day, when you don't disclose, someone's going to sue you. Either you're going to get sued by the family of the person who was killed, or if you do disclose and it's premature, you'll get sued by the person you disclosed about. So you have to choose your poison. I'd always choose in terms of protecting individuals. So for example, if someone just bought a gun, if they're escalating in their jealousy, they're making threats, I'm not sure there's an option. I'm conscious about, we can have a long debate, as we should, about victim autonomy and victims' right to choose and do what's right for them. And I don't want to take that away. However, I do think there needs to be an informed discussion to help a victim make the right decision for her circumstances. I've seen too many cases where someone says, should we call the police? And they say no, and then it's over. It should be an hour-long conversation about the pros and cons of calling the police, how things may be escalating and how things may end. Because people who live with danger may not recognize it themselves or not see the extent of the danger. And that's why they often need a police officer, social worker, advocate to be able to review risk factors and what they mean. So, Margaret, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add, that safety trumps confidentiality. The Privacy Commission is quite clear about this. And so if you can talk specifically about the risks that are involved as the reasons why you make the decision to share information or talk with someone, you have ground to stand on. But understanding what the risks are and using validated tools to identify them are things that can strengthen your position. But mostly I sort of go to what Peter was just saying. We need to be talking with the person about the risk that they are either in danger of committing or experiencing. That has to be first.
I feel like there could be a whole nother webinar just on this topic whenever we talk about imminent harm and when is consent out the window. I get that visual of the teeter-totter and autonomy of the person on one side of the teeter-totter and protection on the other. Thank you so much for your answers to these wonderful questions. I do just want to direct our viewers today to some very valid resources. We're lucky here in Ontario to have the Seniors Safety Line. It's managed by the Assaulted Women's Helpline, available 365 days a year. 24/7. One of the barriers is language. So with the Senior Safety Line, it is available in 200 languages, eliminating just one barrier. As we move forward, maybe I'll let my colleague Rayanne take the lead since I see her face now.
Hi. Thank you again for your excellent presentation and insight into this important issue. I think there was a lot of really good questions, and I agree with Laura. I think we could do another a session on the risk assessment, which we did last year and around the same time when we were looking at the victims and survivors of crime. So something to look at again, because I think it is an important topic and that reporting piece. So just to wrap up, just coming up on tomorrow starts the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And I thought this was good timing to help promote that initiative, which is a global movement and leadership that people are doing across the world, trying to increase awareness around the violence, to end violence against women. So you'll see, I know OAITH, the Ontario Association of Interval Transition Houses, who just recently did a webinar with us last week, is actively engaged in this campaign. So if you're not following them, I would encourage you to check their website and the work that they're doing around this. I think that Amber may have some work or some initiatives, posts around older women in regards to the gender-based violence work. But that is one website that I know of, just because of the webinar that we did, that they will be very active in promoting this. And we should all be doing that in the work that we do, whether we do it by 16 days or even one day. Our voices do make a difference in changing society's views and attitudes around this issue. Just to wrap up, we do have a number of resources and information on our website that people can access. So I encourage you to go to that website, which is eapon.ca. Laura, can you just go to the next slide? And you can find some of our tools and resources there. And we do have a tool on safety planning, which kind of coincides with some of the risk factors that Peter was talking about in his beginning of his presentation. Knowing about guns in the homes and prior instances of suicide, and if things are happening, maybe there's approaches that we can take to ensure people's safety and develop plans and support them to ensure that these horrific events don't happen. And then finally, as we leave, just a reminder to take a couple minutes and give us your feedback. Again, it's about 7 questions, and we do appreciate your information that you provide back to us. So thank you again. I know we did have some questions about whether the webinar are going to be posted and PowerPoints available. They will be posted on our website later today or tomorrow. It does take time to upload these things onto the internet. So as soon as we can get them uploaded, they will be available for you to download and view. If you have any questions, you can contact myself or my colleague Laura. Here's our contact information. Some people were asking about the contact for our speakers. So I did share, I know Peter's information is on the University of Western website, and Margaret is on the learning of, what's it called? I can't remember the learning. I was just on the website 2 seconds ago.
Learningtoendabuse.ca.
Thank you. So I don't know if your actual phone number is there, Margaret, but if people want to get a hold of you, they can contact us directly and we can get them in touch with Margaret directly. So thank you all again for joining us, and please stay tuned. Check out our website for upcoming events, and we will be posting them also to those who have joined our mailing list. So thank you again for our speakers and our translators who joined us as well, and we look forward to future engagements. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.